you should be able to see my screen with the presentation. This is presentation 6. And what we're going to be doing in this presentation is review some of the tools in AGWA that allows you to change the input data to represent different types of disturbances across the watershed or management actions that are occurring within the watershed. Now, excuse me, there we go. One of the reasons why we've developed these tools over the years is because we've worked with a lot of different agencies, okay, in developing AGWA. BLM, the Department of Defense, military bases, NRCS, EPA, their teams in the Forest Service, as well as in the Department of Interior. And so these tools that we've developed have addressed different concerns that they had, okay, related to disturbance. These have 2 slides here, okay, a fire, livestock grazing, as well as incorporating best management practices to try to control erosion or mitigate flood risk. So again, we've developed a suite of tools to address some of these issues. Here's just a list of some of the tools that we've actually developed. I'm not going to go over all of these in this presentation. Land use, land cover modification tool that allows you to go in and change the land use vegetation type within a watershed, either the entire watershed or just a small component of the watershed. We've also worked on using NRI data to characterize vegetation, as well as looking at ecological sites. But basically, the tool allows you to identify an area and change what's there. We have a tool that allows us to essentially incorporate a buffer strip into the model. So we can actually say this length of channel will have a buffer strip of a certain type. So we can actually have input parameters for that area, that buffer around a stream or a lake or water body. We have another tool that looks at military training disturbance. I'm not going to be talking about that tool, but this is something that you can actually apply where you're running heavy vehicles across the landscape. Now, we were looking at Fort Carson when we developed this tool, so we're talking about tanks, okay? But it can be used in different situations where you're seeing essentially a significant amount of soil disturbance. You can incorporate detention and retention ponds into the watershed. We actually developed a tool for doing this, a storage characterization toolkit. You can essentially have multiple pour points within a watershed, or you can delineate an area of concern and find out what watersheds drain from that area or drain through that area. We have a tool that looks at post-fire effects. In the next presentation, Dave is going to talk more about these tools that we've developed for looking at post-fire effects, as well as putting in best management practices post-fire. Okay, I'll have one slide on it in this presentation, but Dave is going to talk about that in more detail. We have developed tools to look at built environments, residential developments, as well as commercial, institutional. All right, Yoga, as part of this presentation, is going to talk about the urban toolkit, and we have a tutorial on the urban toolkit. And then I'll talk a little bit about channel routing, some of the changes you can make there. I already talked about this in the last presentation I gave, but I'll go through some other things that you can actually do. Probably the most heavily used tool is a land cover modification tool. This is where you can actually go and take essentially a polygon that you've created before, like a pasture area, or you can draw a polygon on the screen, and then you change the vegetation type within that polygon. either 100% change, or you can also essentially define a random pattern or a fractal patchy pattern, or specify the percent of successful change within essentially a watershed. Let's say you're going to remove 50% of the mesquite or shrubs in a given area related to a shrub management practice. Okay, so this tool again is one of the more common tools that is used. You can go into your subwatershed. We're looking at an area in this case in the San Pedro Valley. Okay, originally it had essentially two cover types. Now it has one cover type. We changed one type to the other type. Okay, so again, this is a tool they can use. And again, we can actually essentially either change it or create a random pattern of vegetation or a fractal pattern of vegetation within the area of concern. So again, this is a very common tool that we use to change land use, land cover. Here's just an example of that tool at work. We have a small watershed, and we wanted to change the vegetation type from a high plant cover to a low plant cover. And then we essentially modeled the result. So essentially, you can actually say before grazing, after grazing, basically what may happen. And so we're looking at here as a change in hill slope erosion, as well as a change in sediment yield in the channels. And you can see that the high cover had a lower erosion rate compared to, okay, the essentially low cover situation. So again, this is just an example where we went into a small subwatershed and changed the vegetation cover percentage. We actually, in this case, we went from a historic native plant cover, okay, to a mesquite native plant community, which had much lower, essentially, canopy cover, 78% to 25%, and ground cover was 72%, 72% to 40%. Again, this is in KINEROS. Okay, what you can actually physically do is go to a channel system. You have to identify essentially the beginning and end of the riparian zone. Okay, we would then physically break, okay, the hill slope element. So we have a unique hill slope element, okay, for that riparian area. And this is where we're using two planes. We have the upper plane and the lower plane. The lower plane would be the buffer, and you can have different input for these two planes in terms of vegetation cover, as well as essentially the gradient of the slope. So you can actually incorporate, okay, an area with higher cover in the buffer zone compared to the upland part of essentially the plane. All right, and so this again is something that you can essentially use to put in something different along essentially the channel. In this case, we're talking about mainly a buffer. This is another example of using, okay, the land cover change tool. We can incorporate, for example, an urban development within the watershed. That includes maybe potentially changing the channel system, as well as essentially the change, okay, in cover, and that model essentially the result. So in this situation, we had an urban area essentially being proposed within a subwatershed in San Pedro, okay, and then we actually model the potential impact of that development. And you can see down channel of that development, we saw higher runoff rates, as well as higher essentially runoff occurring. You can see the change in colors from essentially very light to very dark. All right, so again, we're seeing an impact of development. So we're incorporating the change within essentially the watershed. In this case, essentially a proposed development. Post-fire effects tool. Okay, again, Dave is going to talk more about this, okay, in the next presentation. So we're evaluating the post-fire effects of a fire. This is a small watershed in Idaho, where we basically are looking at what would be the impact on runoff and erosion, okay, if half of the watershed was burnt and all of the watershed was burnt, okay? And basically, we change, okay, the vegetation based on burn severity, as well as we change the height, essentially the Manning's N value, okay, essentially for the hill slopes. And where you can see that we have the pre-fire situation where we saw very low runoff for a 5-year, 30-minute design storm, okay? All right, 35% of the watershed was burnt in one case, a partial burn, and then 100% of the watershed was burnt, okay? We essentially look at, again, burn severity in these situations. You can see that the partial case, the only upper part of the watershed was burnt. We saw an increase in runoff, okay, cubic meters per second, approaching 150 cubic meters per second, where before it was basically below 50, very close to zero for this event. And then the entire watershed were approaching 350 cubic meters per second. So again, you can see that the fire had a significant impact on, okay, runoff in this situation. This is what we actually use with the BEAR teams, okay, the Burn Area Emergency Response teams in the Department of Interior, as well as the Forest Service. Here's an important set of tools that we have. You can have multiple pour points identified, as well as doing a multiple watershed analysis. Now, with the multiple pour points, you can have more than one pour point that you will force the model essentially to force AGWA to model to that point. Okay, that will be an endpoint, okay, for a sub watershed. So in this example I'm showing you here, we had the main pour point for the entire watershed, and then we had a secondary pour point, an internal pour point that we would model to. The model will break on that point and we get actually output for that specific point. So that could be an area of concern, essentially within your watershed, or it could be an internal gauge site within your essentially larger watershed. And you want to model to that point as well as to the entire to the pour point that represents the entire watershed. So this is an important tool. We use this a lot when we're working post-fire. Usually, essentially a BEAR team will have identified what they call essentially VARs, values at risk, okay? And we will model to those values at risk within the larger watershed, okay? And it will force the model to essentially to provide output, hydrograph and sediment graph for that specific location. Now, the multiple watershed analysis allows you to identify an area of interest, like a fire or an allotment, okay, some type of disturbance, and it will then identify all the drainages from that area, okay? You know, what drains from that area or what drains through that area, the watershed that drains through that area. So again, if you have some type of disturbance like a wildfire, you would identify the essentially wildfire area, okay, and you would find all the watersheds that drain from that area or through that area, okay? Okay, and then you'd be able to identify, you know, which watershed you are interested in terms of that disturbance. Okay, so in this case, maybe this was a fire area, and you're actually seeing that essentially we had much higher flows on the west side compared to the east side. Routing tools and options. Dave talked a little bit about this dealing with KINEROS. We do have a pond/reservoir tool, so you can actually essentially place on the channel system a pond or reservoir, and then you basically could model water flowing into the reservoir and out of the reservoir with some type of control structure. Okay, you can also identify an area where you have essentially diversion. In some cases, you may call that an artificial wetland. I'll show you a figure of this in a second. You can actually remove channels. Okay, that does happen with development. Essentially, that you actually will remove channels or replace channels. Some of the natural channels will essentially go away, and they'll put in a man-made channel in a development. You also can, and I talked about this earlier, parameterize a channel with the depth, essentially values, essentially the hydraulic conductivity of the bottom sediment. We typically recommend, 0 for perennial streams, but you can actually assign what is the hydraulic conductivity of your bottom sediment of a channel. Change the roughness value. Armoring, that's related to the erodibility of the channel itself. It can go to 0 if you want. You can have compound channels. And then again, each channel reach can have unique parameters. Okay. So one thing we've actually developed for essentially putting a pond essentially into a KINEROS setup, okay, is that you can actually identify and characterize an existing structure or one that you are proposing. You can calculate the dam discharge, basically the stage to discharge relationship, okay? And then you can export essentially all that information into KINEROS. So you're identifying where that structure will be on the channel system, and you can identify its storage capacity, as well as essentially create a stage discharge relationship for that structure. Right. Okay. And we have these different essentially pop-up windows where you would put in the information, okay, that you need to characterize the existing storage, or essentially calculate the dam discharge, essentially the stage, okay, essentially discharge relationship, and then where do you want it routed, or essentially where do you want it essentially develop the input file for KINEROS. Here's an example of the tool in use. Okay, we had a point identifying the location of a small stock pond. This was on the one of the military bases in California that we were working on. Okay, so we know the location of the pond. Okay, using the DEM, in this case, essentially a LiDAR DEM that we actually had. Okay, we could identify the storage behind this pond. Basically, it would be the depth where essentially the area that would be submerged before water started running out of it through this emergency spillway over on the right-hand side. Please note that we can actually see in this LiDAR image the emergency spillway as well. So we actually have the storage area behind it, as well as basically essentially where it will flow out of, okay, in that elevation. I might add, this was so high, we can actually get the characteristics of the emergency spillway as well, okay? Okay. And so we have now defined the different features of this pond, okay? Using the GIS capabilities, we have identified basically the amount of storage. We have a essentially depth to storage essentially relationship. We also have developed another relationship. We'll look at essentially the stage to discharge relationship, okay, in this structure. I might add, when you're working in the western part of the United States, there's usually ponds everywhere, especially in rangeland conditions. Okay, they provide water for essentially livestock, they trap sediment, they retain floodwaters. So if you're doing a full watershed assessment, you really need to include your ponds. Okay, and ponds can be viewed as essentially stormwater retention structures, as well as sediment basins. Sediment is going to be trapped in these ponds. Okay, and it is a common best management practice for mitigating flood risk as well as water quality mitigation. So again, being able to model ponds, okay, as a best management practice, or essentially a current best management practice is really important. And so what actually we're looking at here is what would be the relative difference between, okay, pre and post stock ponds, essentially channel runoff, okay, from this small watershed, which is located to the Walnut Gulch Experimental Watershed. All right, and so you can estimate the pre and the post runoff, the percent differences, as well as the sediment essentially flow coming out of that area. So again, this is something that you can actually essentially do for KINEROS. Okay, and I believe for SWAT as well, we can put in the ponds, okay, where they are occurring within the watershed. Okay, diversions. Okay, we can basically divert water out of the channel and put it back in the channel. In this situation, we're trying to represent, okay, a potential man-made wetland. All right, so we have water going into essentially a pond. We can route the water out of the pond through this essentially channel system into another pond, and then model basically the outflow from that pond, and then essentially deliver that water back into the channel. So this is where you can actually represent like a man-made wetland or any type of diversion out of essentially the primary stream. We can have overbank flow as well to decrease downstream flooding. So you can actually basically create a channel that is two parts. One would be the primary channel, the other one would be the overflow bank area. Okay, and this would be something that could address what would happen when you have overflow into a natural riparian area. Okay, and so it looks something like this. You have your compound channel, you have your primary channel that is deeper, and then you have, okay, your overflow bank area. And it can be either flat or it can have a rising, essentially channel bed. All right, but again, this would be essentially a situation you would have flow going down the main channel. Eventually, it will top out and start flowing over to essentially the overflow bank area. Okay, so this would represent what you'd see under a natural situation with a riparian area, with a buffer area. We talked about this before. You can change the input parameters for a channel to represent different management actions, channel improvements. Okay, for example, cleaning a channel, something they do in urban areas on a regular basis, that would change the Manning's end. You would be removing debris, moving essentially logs out of the channel, or in an urban area, shopping carts. Channel stabilization, it would change the shape as well as change the Manning's end, as well as changing the amount of infiltration. This would be zero hydraulic conductivity for this channel. Okay, soil cement, sediment source. Okay, again, you'd have no sediment coming from essentially from the banks in this situation either. It would be 100% armored. Okay, channel hardening, again, it's very simple as channel stabilization. Okay, the impacts would be increased velocity, decreased storage, decreased transmission losses, increased flooding downstream, increased channel scour downstream, okay, as well as loss of habitat. So again, these are things that you can do. If you're going to see a project where you're going to go out and clean the channel, or you're going to stabilize the channel banks, or go in and harden the channel, you can model the impact of that action. All right, Yoga, I'll let you talk about this.
Thanks, Phil. And if you don't mind, I'll have you scroll through the slides as well.
All right.
So the motivation behind creating the AGWA Urban tool was KINEROS was really good at modeling the smaller watersheds, and it had some functionality which was still not in AGWA, where we could represent urban areas in more detail. So part of my master's and PhD work was trying to get that functionality into AGWA, into the GIS framework. So use the KINEROS2 model, use GIS, and start representing urban areas in these two softwares. So the goal of the urban tool is to model each lot, your house, the roof, the driveway, front yard, backyards, and pools as well. And then put it all together so you can run a watershed analysis on a smaller scale. It could be a neighborhood, it could be down one street, it could be a subdivision, or you can also go to larger areas of urban areas or even the whole urban area, but then it becomes more data intensive. At larger scales, when you start going above the lot scale, the AGWA Urban tool lets you customize the routing involved in the urban area. So it's a point and click mechanism where you, as the user, supply what path the water is going to take. So in existing systems, you might already have an idea how the water flows, or if you're developing a new system, this is where you get to play around in terms of how you want to route the flow in your upcoming subdivision. You want it to go down the streets, where do you need to put an underground sewer system, and then where will the outlet of all that water go downstream somewhere as well. So the user gets to decide what that flow route is going to be and give it to the tool. And since we're working at such a small scale, we also wanted to focus on green infrastructure practices, and 3 in specific: retention basins, permeable pavements, and cisterns that capture water off the roof. So we included that functionality in it as well. And it follows the same process similar to the other tutorials you've worked, where you start by putting a geodatabase together, then start discretizing your elements, put in the parameters, create the input files, provide the precipitation data, run the model, bring the results back, and then view the results as well. So it's the same set of flow, similar to the original AGWA tool, but it's a separate add-in now. Phil, if you don't mind, can you go to the next slide, please? So the KINEROS2 model has an urban element, which is shown on the right with all those different colors, that can discretely model various impervious and pervious areas in different combinations. So there's a directly connected pervious area, which just says that is a small element in the urban element, where if the water falls, you can set a KS value to allow the water to infiltrate. And once that infiltration capacity is reached, the water will flow over into the street. So all of the overland flow goes towards the street from the lot and then down the street as it follows the route on the street or in the neighborhood or in the larger watershed. But with these smaller areas, now you can start representing these discrete elements on our lots. So in the case of AGWA, what it does is it uses the indirectly connected impervious area to represent a roof, the connecting pervious area to represent a front yard, the directly connected impervious area to represent a driveway. Non-contributing areas can be used to represent pools where the water never flows out. It's a sink. It could be a sink in your backyard as well. And then you can represent half of the street in front of the house. And along with this, green infrastructure practices are represented similarly as well. So any water that falls in the indirectly connected impervious area can be captured into a cistern. And once the cistern fills up, it starts to overflow and will flow into the connecting pervious. And when the infiltration capacity of the connecting pervious is met, the water will flow into the street. And all of the other elements give you the functionality to put a retention basin at the end of it. So you can provide a depth, a volume, an infiltration rate. So any water that flows off that subcomponent goes into the basin. Once the basin fills up, it's also infiltrating at the same time. But once it starts overflowing, the water goes into the street. The directly connected impervious that is used to represent driveways can be given a KS value to indicate that it could be a permeable driveway as well. And then the street can have a KS value to indicate that the street itself can be permeable as well. And then the street also has a curb cutout section, which is similar to a retention basin on the side of the street. So the water can flow from the street into the basin first, and then once it overflows, it'll go down the street to the next element downstream, basically. In general, the KINEROS2 flow route assumption is on the bottom left, where water will flow from a lot down the street, and then it'll accumulate down the street as the water comes from all the adjoining routes to the lowest part of the watershed. It still uses all the equations that KINEROS2 offers, So the kinematic wave equations are still used in order to route the water. But instead of the plane and the channel components, you use an urban element. So when Dave was talking about the power file and how everything is represented using a plane element, a channel element, in the case of the urban component, any lot that you want to represent is represented by its own element called the urban element. And you can still include planes and channels, but the functionality in AGWA is only restricted to the urban element. So if you want to include all of that together, then that's something where you'll have to open the power file and start modifying things in there. You can go to the next slide, Phil. So as part of the tutorial number 13, where you're assessing the post-development effects and the impact of green structure in Sierra Vista, you're looking at this watershed, basically. So when we developed the tool, we tested it out on this watershed, which Dave mentioned before as well, which had good instrumentation in terms of gauges and weirs on the inlet and the outlet. So we had good data in this watershed that we could use to validate how the urban tool would work once implemented in AGWA. So we have 66 residential parcels. They are very similarly built. And we decided to do 3 types of analysis. One, understand how the water is coming off the streets, which is 2.27 hectares, around 16% of the total area of the watershed and 50% of the total impervious area inside the watershed. We also decided to do a roof runoff analysis. So we put in a 38 cubic meter cistern on each parcel to capture any water that comes off the street. And we ran the model for 10 years, or we ran 10 years worth of precipitation data to understand how the cistern would fill. We set up conditions on how it is emptied and what happens when the cistern fills up as well. And lastly, we wanted to try out different GI scenarios where what would happen if there was no GI practices on each of these parcels. What would happen if there was one retention basin on all of them, if all the driveways were made permeable, and if we had a cistern on all of the parcels. So we ran those scenarios as well. The link at the bottom is to the paper that we published that came out of the study. But the next slide will show you the results that we have. So Phil, if you don't mind, can you go to the next slide? So if you look at them one by one, on the right to the top is the roof runoff analysis. In Sierra Vista, most of the rainfall is high intensity during the summer, and then in the winter, it's more low intensity, larger duration rainfall. So we noticed that most of the volume that we could capture of the roofs was during those summer months from July, August, and September. There was still some capture, but the rainfall volume itself wasn't enough to capture a lot of water to begin with. But then we compared it to the per capita water usage in Cochise County, which Sierra Vista is part of. And that's that black line, which indicates how much that average water usage is on a monthly basis. So definitely for the summer months, the roof runoff that we capture can meet those per capita water demands. And if we can store that water long term, you could potentially use all of that water to meet the demand throughout the year. But it involves storage and water treatment as well, based on how you want to use the water. So this was just a hypothetical scenario that could help inform whoever's living that, hey, if you size the cistern correctly, if you have a large enough roof area, you might be able to capture all this water that you can use to supplement your water use. And then you don't have to rely on the city for that much water, and you're paying less bills in terms of how much water you're using as well. So that was the roof runoff analysis. On the bottom right is the street runoff analysis. And we wanted to understand how much water is just coming from the streets, because the streets is a highly connected impervious network. At least on the parcels, there are pervious areas where the water has a chance to infiltrate before it starts accumulating. But on the streets, any rainfall that falls on the street is just going to go downstream as fast as possible. So what we found was more than 45%, and 45 is the lowest in the month of June, that most of the runoff coming out of that watershed was off the street. And in some cases, it was more than 70% as well. So if you are a planner trying to figure out flood mitigation, you will need to target the streets in order to either capture this water so it can be used locally, or divert this water downstream to either a larger retention basin or a detention basin for that matter, or to the nearest wash or channel as well. But in the summer months, when the volume of water is larger as well, the water coming out from the parcels, it can meet the same amount of water that's coming off the street. So that was a very interesting analysis that came out of that as well. And then to the bottom left is the analysis of the different scenarios. So we wanted to compare, we wanted to look at the difference between what would happen if we put in GI and then compare it to what would happen if there was no GI in the first place. So the basic takeaway from that was, depending on the size of the GI practice that you can put, in the simulations, we can put any value we want to see how it would react. But turns out in a similar comparison between the 3 GI practices, the permeable pavements, the retention basins, and the rainwater harvesting systems, retention basins were doing a better job at reducing the average runoff volumes coming out from each parcel, and mostly because they have a higher KS or infiltration rate. They have also storage capacity at the same time, so it's double the benefits. But then the only caveat is that you need to have that much room to dig out a basin in your yards to capture all of that water. Driveways and rainwater harvesting was limited because the size of the driveways was very small on each of these parcels, and the size of the roofs was smaller compared to the entire lot. So the water that could be captured out of them was not as high as, say, a retention basin, which was able to capture all the water that's coming off the lot. But these practices seem to be most effective during the summer months, again, when the total volumes were larger as compared to the winter months. So that was the Sierra Vista case study. Recently, we've also done some case studies in the city of Tucson, in the high school watch, which includes the university. And we have some published papers about that as well, if anyone's interested. But in tutorial 13, you get to play around with this tool. Just keep in mind that this tool is not part of the original add-in. So if you want to run that tutorial, you will have to install the urban add-in separately. And you may want to delete the original add-in and install the urban add-in. But let us know if you're planning on doing that, and we'll give you those detailed instructions. But that's it from this presentation. I don't know, Phil, if you had any concluding remarks, or Shay.
No more remarks from me at this point.
No, but are there any questions?
I will send the links to the papers. There's a question in the chat that wants the links to the papers, and I will give you those links right now.